Kim for the kind introduction. As Kim mentioned, my name's Elise Cusick. I work for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in our local Tasmanian State Office. To begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Palawa people as the original owners and continuing custodians of Luturita, Tasmania, and pay my respects to elders past and present. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, Australia in the Neighbourhood, Rising to the Challenge, hosted by the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Tonight we will hear from former Australian diplomat and Ambassador Ian Kemish, who will reflect on Australia's standing in the Indo-Pacific and the opportunity for our nation to help build a more secure neighbourhood through a new approach, one of which combines a fresh approach to international partnerships with significant changes to the way we think and learn at home. Before formally introducing Ian, I would like to take the opportunity to speak briefly about an Australian government initiative that Ian has championed for years. An initiative which invests in the people-to-people exchange across our neighbourhood. The New Colombo Plan, also referred to as the NCP, aims to lift the knowledge of the Indo-Pacific in Australia by supporting Australian undergraduate students to live, learn and intern in over 40 locations across the Indo-Pacific. The NCP, along with the Australia Awards program, contribute to enhancing Australia's reach and influence in the region, delivering effective two-way education, training and research mobility. Since 2014, almost 70,000 students from Australian universities have received New Colombo Plan scholarships and mobility grants, including over 800 students from the University of Tasmania. Both the NCP and Australian Awards programs are transformational, nurturing and enriching a generation of future leaders who are connected through diverse and resilient global networks. It's worth noting that the opportunity for NCP recipients are not exclusive to their time as a scholar or grant holder. The NCP Alumni Program helps fellow NCP's recipients stay connected as they progress through their lives and careers. The NCP alumni are a growing cohort of young Australian professionals with Indo-Pacific experience, language skills and understanding, building new opportunities for Australia in the region. The current NCP Alumni Ambassador for Tasmania, Sanjana Badakul, unfortunately was unable to join us tonight. However, I'd like to share a bit about Sanjana and her experience with the NCP. With her NCP scholarship, Sanjana completed the final semester of a degree in medical research at the National University of Singapore. Whilst in country, she participated in a research project with a focus on molecular biology and biotechnology and volunteered at local schools. Sanjana is passionate about humanitarian aid and finding ways to connect healthcare and improve access to health resources within the Asia-Pacific region. Since returning from her program, Sanjana has been completing her medical degree whilst undertaking clinical research. She's also working with Planned Child Health, an NGO which focuses on using public health approach to develop sustainable health systems to support children living with chronic diseases in low-income countries. As the 2022 Alumni Ambassador for Tasmania, she's worked alongside University of Tasmania to reconnect students and other NCP alumni and promote the NCP program in the community. Earlier this year, she attended the NCP Summit in Canberra and the pre-departure training, where she was able to connect with and support other scholars as they embark on their NCP journey. We are very fortunate to have alumni like Sanjana promoting the NCP program to future scholars. The NCP program is also extremely fortunate to have business champions who play an important role in promoting the value of regional study to a student's future career prospects and in fostering business engagements with the New Colombo Plan. Which brings me to our guest speaker, Ian Kemish, who is one of the NCP business champions. In a diplomatic career spanning 25 years, Ian has served as Australian High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea, Ambassador to Germany, Head of the Prime Minister's International Division, and Head of DFAT Southeast Asia Division, as well as the Head of Consular Services. Ian was awarded the membership of the Order of Australia for his leadership of Australia's response to the 2002 Bali bombings. In his recently released book, The Consul, an insider's account from Australia's diplomatic frontline, Ian gives us an insight and personal perspective into the role of the head of Australia's consular service. And as Kim mentioned earlier, we have Fuller's with us this evening with copies of the Consul to purchase. Tonight, Ian will draw on themes covered in his book to offer personal perspective on how Australia has responded to the major international challenges of the last 2 decades, from global strategic threats to international terrorism, regional conflicts, natural disasters and hostage diplomacy. At the end of the presentation, Ian will be joined by Kim Boyer for a question and answer. Please join me in welcoming Ian Kemish.
Thank you, Liz. That's great. Evening, everybody. Great to be here. Privileged to be here on Palawa land. Wonderful to be in Tasmania. I've always thought that Tasmanians really do punch above their weight in terms of Australia's broader international engagement in the region and more broadly on the global stage. I think about former colleagues, names that may mean something to somebody here, like James Wise and David Ritchie, people who ran our Pacific Division, both proud Tasmanians, and of course, arguably the best top diplomat that we've had in our history, Ashton Calvert, was from this state, was a product of this university and was a Rhodes Scholar. He took the opportunity of a scholarship program to reach out into the world and left a real impact. And I think that's what we think about, that's what we reflect on when we think about the New Colombo Plan, a different kind of program for today's generation, which supports young, believe me, very able, bright Australians. I've conducted some interview panels to reach out into the world to gain experience and in turn to help build our literacy here in Australia about our neighbourhood. Elise and I promise you did not speak about my presentation tonight, but she's obviously done a little bit of research because she mentioned in her introduction that I might end up reflecting a little bit about how we think at home and how we learn about the region here in Australia, because I do think that is absolutely key to how we respond to the challenges of the region today. But look, let me thank Kim, let me thank the AIIA. I think the AIIA is a terrific institution. I have engaged with it over many, many years, and in recent times I've had the opportunity to speak at both the Brisbane and Perth branches now about my book, The Consul, which you've heard a little bit about. And you are very welcome to buy it later, and I am very happy to sign it. I'm going to touch on the themes of The Consul while talking about the theme I've been set, which is, you know, how we respond to the challenges of the neighbourhood. But let me just squarely tell you what that book's about. It is avowedly not a diplomatic memoir, was never intended as one. Indeed, I have been heard to say in the deeper past that I think there's a special place in hell for people who write diplomatic memoirs, at least those memoirs that talk about, you know, I did this, I did that. Instead, what it's intended to be is a book about what the men and women of the Australian Consular Service do on a daily basis behind closed doors in responding to our fellow Australians when they encounter serious difficulty overseas. I'm not talking about lost passports, I'm talking about the 3 to 5 Australians who die overseas every 24 hours in normal time. And they too are the same people who step forward when a major crisis erupts. So, you know, I was proud to lead that part of the service for a period in my career, as Elise has said. That's what that book's about, and I will touch on some of the things in that book as I talk about this theme around the neighbourhood. Now, you know, we talk a lot about the region here in Australia. And to be honest, we're a bit loose in our definitions. You hear the term Indo-Pacific bandied around, you hear the term Asia-Pacific bandied around. Asia-Pacific, I think, was probably invented by Australia because it happened to combine the two regions that we inhabit. Indo-Pacific, I happen to know, was coined by a former head of DFAT, Peter Varghese, who had been High Commissioner in India and who saw a broader strategic pattern across that bigger region. For tonight's purpose, when I'm talking about the neighbourhood, I'm thinking about what some people wrongly refer to as the arc of instability, but there's certainly an arc which you might think of as commencing out there to the northeast of where we are now, in southern Melanesia around Fiji, spreading up through the Melanesian chain to include Papua New Guinea and then including the islands of Indonesia. I'm thinking about the immediate neighbourhood when I'm talking tonight. So the Southwest Pacific and close in archipelagic Southeast Asia. Now, that region has actually been recognised as the primary region of strategic concern for Australia for a very long time. Many governments claim that they invented the focus on that region. You might argue that the Hawke-Keating government pioneered some new approaches there, but let's not forget, what previous governments did. The Whitlam government certainly. But think for a moment about the old Colombo Plan. It wasn't called that, it was called the Colombo Plan. That was born in 1951 when Bob Menzies was Prime Minister of this country, and it was seen as an opportunity by the government of this nation to engage with our region in new ways by bringing students from the developing world in our region to Australian schools and universities. And I personally have seen the impact of that old Colombo Plan. In that period where I was working with the Prime Minister, at one point we visited Malaysia and we had a meeting with the assembled cabinet of Malaysia, and about half of them had studied in Australia under the Colombo Plan, and there was this other kind of connection with them. I saw the benefit of that. And this new Colombo Plan, which reverses all of that and seeks to send Australians out into the region and help them build their understanding of it, is motivated partly by a similar impulse, that impulse to embrace, engage, build common understanding with this part of the world that we're talking about. I think that, when all is said and done, we here in Australia have taken this part of the world pretty seriously for a long time, as I say. Certainly within my time as a diplomat, there was never any doubt that the region we're talking about was the top priority. It's where our best resources are allocated. Now, you've heard it said I was ambassador in Germany and I was High Commissioner in Papua New Guinea. Total staff at the Australian Embassy in Berlin is about 80. Total staff at the Australian High Commission in Papua New Guinea is about 300, and there's another 100 Australian government officials. There's a $600 million aid program that is administered by the Australian High Commission in Papua New Guinea, the single largest bilateral aid program that Australia has. There's a $250 million defence program across the Pacific. We have a cadre of expertise and young and old professionals who really know their way around the region. I don't see a lot of deficit in those terms in our engagement with the Pacific, but there are some deficits, and I'll come to them. I think it's also important to recognise that Australia is expected to and does step up when things go wrong in the region. Now, my own career has been punctuated to some extent by some fairly major flashpoints in the region, and I've been part of Australia stepping forward in seeking to influence in a positive way developments there. My own experience in doing so has taught me a couple of things. It's It's taught me, first of all, that our influence in the region does not rest on the size of our aid program or the size of our defence relationship or the amount of money we put into the region. I'll tell you one thing, aid programs do not buy you influence. What does get you influence is relationship and understanding. Now I think about the sort of larger moments in my career, in my life. I think about my own baptism of fire when I took on the consular service, the eruption first of a coup in Fiji in May 2000. It was about a third of several, but it was quite a serious one for a period there. And our grave concern about Australian nationals in particular and how to manage this situation. It was followed, we were slapped around the face soon afterwards by a conflagration that took place in Solomon Islands, where civil war led to us needing to conduct a major, slightly faulty seaborne evacuation from that country for not only Australians but many others. We were the party with resources, and the point is that for those sorts of evacuations and for that sort of contingency planning, we don't think only about Australian citizens. We're the country in the neighbourhood that has the resources, we're the country in the neighbourhood that has the capacity, and so we find ourselves looking after the nationals of many, many other countries, not just the normal suspect, New Zealand, Britain, US, Canada, not only those sorts of countries. We find ourselves essentially taking responsibility for a pretty global community at moments like that, and it reflects a little bit the kind of country we are and the kind of place we are. In more recent times, as Australian High Commissioner in Papua New Guinea, I was in the job when we had the most interesting of times in 2011, 2012, where I won't get into too much of the detail, but essentially we had a major rift in the national fabric where we found ourselves with two people claiming the prime ministership of the country, one backed by the courts, one backed by the parliament, and the police and defence force started to splinter and things started to look pretty ugly. And as the Australian head of mission in Papua New Guinea, I was expected by my government to try and help do something about this, try and help keep the temperature down, prevent it from boiling over into serious conflict. I think my team and I actually managed to do that, but we did it in the way I hinted at earlier on, not because we were the big stick, but because we had built a web of relationship and could influence things that way. So, Australia doesn't have a bad record, and it would be wrong of me not to mention, particularly at this moment, one of our biggest moments in the immediate region, which happened almost 20 years ago, the Bali bombing. The story of the Bali bombing, the inside story of that response is in the middle of my book, and it in many ways was a very significant, very formative experience for me. I won't go on about it too much, but I'll, cast your minds back. We had a situation where global jihadism came close to our shores. 89 of the 202 who were killed that night, mostly young people, called Australia home. And we launched a very, very significant, still the biggest ever, aeromedical evacuation together, initially to bring people to safety, bring people to proper hospital treatment here in Australia. The point I would make in this context, though, about that response is that it said something about Australia. We not only did the aeromedical evacuation, I'll come back to that, but we led the disaster victim identification process, because you don't really want to know the detail, but the process of identifying the dead was arduous, difficult and highly complex, and it
it was actually specifically the Australian Federal Police who led that response. The unusual thing about that whole series of events, and the response went for months, was that Australia stood up a major multi-dimensional crisis response on the sovereign territory of another country. And we did so at their invitation, because there was recognition that we were the party who could do it. And when you think about that aeromedical evacuation, again, we weren't just evacuating Australians, we weren't just evacuating third country nationals, we were evacuating Balinese rickshaw drivers from Bali into Australian hospitals. Frankly, you couldn't tell the nationality of the victims, nor could you tell their ethnicity. That's how badly people were impacted by the event. So interesting, right? Interesting that it took us a little while to realise. I think it was at some point in the early hours of that morning on the 13th of October that we realised that we're actually just going to be doing this for everybody. That this was no longer a traditional consular response, that this was a national response. And I want to return to that theme, because if we're going to be effective in the region, we've got to work broadly as a nation, not delegate engagement with the region only to government. I'm going to come back to that. But certainly the Bali incident was a case in point. Australian volunteers, nurses, doctors, people from all corners of society were involved in the response to an event in our immediate region. So, where are we now? We're at a situation where there's a new level of focus on the region. Bizarrely, unusually, we found ourselves focusing in on foreign policy and the South Pacific during a federal election campaign. We've never done that before. Foreign policy doesn't feature in national elections here in Australia. But we did, and we did because there was a strong perception that somehow our big strategic competitor, China, had stolen a march on us. In Solomon Islands in particular, and there was the previous government had made quite a lot of noise, frankly, about its response to these strategic threats, and found itself just on the eve of an election caught a bit short, at least in the perception of our media. So, since then we've had a new government whose instincts, frankly, probably were a bit more to focus on Southeast Asia, putting a whole lot of effort and initiative into the Pacific because of this clear narrative about strategic threat. We've seen Foreign Minister Wong engage very intensively across the region. We've now seen, just in this last week, the United States host a major conference with the Pacific leadership, announce an $810 million US program, an 11-point agreement, and step in a way that we haven't seen from the US in quite some time. This follows, in some ways, a failure by the Chinese leadership and by the Chinese foreign minister in particular to pull off a security agreement with countries of the region. So this is the narrative, right? The whole discussion about the Pacific is the Chinese and us, and that's important, but it's only important up to a certain point. Because I see two deficits in the way we talk about the region today and in the way we approach the region. One is that I think we don't know enough about the region as Australians. It's sometimes a bit embarrassing. I remember certainly in Papua New Guinea, being quite struck by how Papua New Guineans, young and old, knew a lot about our politics, a lot about our culture. Certainly know a lot about our rugby league teams, but they feel like participants in our society. The Pacific can be a real blind spot. Indeed, the immediate region can be a bit of a blind spot for Australians. There are many who are thoroughly engaged in it, But you know, through the COVID era, we probably all knew through the media what was happening in London in terms of the pandemic. We knew what was happening in the US because we could see it on the television and we could read about it in the newspapers. Few of us thought much about what was happening closer to home. Some of us did, but not many of us did. And you know, I think that, you know, with the greatest respect, it's hard for many Australians to identify the country of the Pacific, name their capitals, give a rough indication of where they are. We struggle with this stuff, and we only seem to pay attention when our own position in the region appears to be under threat. There's this instinct of strategic denial that can get our attention big time in the region. It was ever thus. We've been worried variously through our history about the French, about the Russians, about the Germans, about the Japanese. You know, there have been moments in our history where we have suddenly focused in on the region, and it has tended to be when we perceive a threat from without. And this is one of the problems I have with the way we've been talking about the Pacific recently. We almost talk about it sometimes as if it's a vacant lot in which we duke it out with the Chinese, rather than a place that has agency, that has people who have their own concerns, who have their own preoccupations. So when we're banging on about AUKUS and nuclear submarines to a group of nations who, for whom nuclear technology has a dark and difficult history. Let's not forget the nuclear testing that has taken place in the Pacific over the course of the last century. And when we're talking about investing huge capital in defence and other strategic assets to a group of fragile nations that are concerned about things like climate change, we seem to be talking the wrong language. And I think if we're going to be influential and serious in the region, we need to stop doing that. There have been some really positive signs. In some ways, this new government is just better placed politically to talk the same language as the Pacific than its predecessor, because it has different domestic settings when it comes to climate change. And I can see a much better effort being made to speak a language of genuine partnership with the region. So that's one deficit that needs addressing. And the final, and I'll wrap up in a moment, the second is the one I spoke about earlier, which is this sense of almost ignorance about the region that we have in Australia sometimes. This is where programs like the New Colombo plan come in. I was, fortunate to be in the circle of people that Julie Bishop spoke to about this idea when the idea was becoming reality, and I know that it was motivated by a desire to change things at home. I co-authored an article with Joanne Wallace from Adelaide University about a month ago, and its title was this: Key to Relationships with the Pacific is Education, ours, not theirs. And I think that's quite fundamental, because if we're really going to be influential in the region, we need to know a lot more about it. New Colombo plan, place to get hope. And I think that generation is embracing the opportunity with both hands. They're grabbing the opportunity with both hands. We should be pleased about that, but we should continue to recognise that we're all participants here, and if we're going to engage as a nation successfully with this region, then we've got to be in it too. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Does anyone want to go and get another drink before we do Q&A? It's not a wild rush for the bar. Okay. So we need to have questions from the floor. can I start with a question and then everyone can think about other questions? Ian, you didn't mention Timor and the issues about the bugging of the Timorese government and so on has left a fairly nasty taste in various international relations back to their throats. Can you talk a bit about how we can rebuild our relationship with Timor?
I think the good news is that we are rebuilding it. Ramaswamy was here only, 3 weeks ago, it feels like. The newly re-elected president of Timor-Leste. And he was asked almost that question. He was asked, can there be trust between our two countries against the background of these reports about espionage against their economic interests? And he said, oh yes, of course we can have trust. We have trust now. He said, it's different people running Australia these days. was his line. Look, it's an interesting and complex history. Yes, there has been that moment, it was wrong. But it was also Australia which stepped forward at the moment of where independence raised itself as a possibility in 1999. It happened almost by accident, has to be said. John Howard wrote a letter and the slightly eccentric president of Indonesia jumped at it and we suddenly found ourselves in a referendum about self-determination in what was then called East Timor. But it was Australia that led the multilateral force. It was Australian troops who contributed significantly. Some of them, endured serious trauma and hardship in the interests of Timorese independence. I don't think people forget that. It cost us. Again, if I may, as I mentioned in this book, part of the context of that time, late 90s, was that the threat of global jihadism had been building almost, and we'd almost been oblivious to it. God knows why, because the signs were all there. The US embassies two US embassies in Africa had been blown up. Al-Qaeda had targeted the World Trade Center already, but we were almost oblivious to it. And our deployment in Timor led Osama bin Laden to identify us as enemy, because we were participating in a force that was focused on splintering a Muslim nation. This history is really complex, and you could talk about it for hours. There is still with Timor, of course, a problem to resolve, and that is just exactly how the Greater Sunrise gas fields are exploited. But that really is between a company and the Timorese government. Australia isn't a party to it.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? And if you've got a question, do you mind coming up to the microphone? Because otherwise it can't be recorded for what's being recorded to be played on the AIIA national website. So do you mind coming up?
Yes, I will.
Thank you very much.
My name's Peter Davison-Galley. I'm a philosopher by trade, so out of my discipline. But for what it's worth, I found your remarks about the important dynamic for our engagement in the region is people-people engagement, and the new Colombo plan, for that matter the old Colombo plan, contributing to that. The key people I would have thought you wanted doing that sort of stuff were folk like you and the broader aid, come military, come security, come whatever the governmental agencies and non-governmental agencies are. And there's been a worry, I gather, in the region that a number of the people involved historically have not had a mutual respect relationship with the region, but more a patronising paternalism, Australia's interest-focused sort of thing. Do you see room for change there, or has the change already occurred?
Thank you. There's always room for improvement. I
think about my own direct personal experience, I have had moments where I have seen officials take an approach, or indeed politicians, take an approach to people of the region that has jarred a little bit with me, and I've been frank as a servant of government in calling it out when I've seen it. I think it's terribly important that officials are prepared to step into the political level and say, look, you're doing this wrong. So there have been moments. Generally speaking, we're pretty good at this. I think about our young officials, our young diplomats, the kind of young stars that I had around me at the Australian High Commission in Papua New Guinea. These are people who really were interested in the country and understood the importance of humility and understood the importance of relationship and all the rest of it. I think for the large part, Australians are pretty good at relationship in the region. There's a tell though, you can tell the people who don't quite get it. The people who you see puffing themselves up a little bit about our size and importance in the region. I used to, sometimes drive into the High Commission with some visiting official, and this is the High Commission in PNG. It's big building, sort of big significant projection of Australia. And when you see people sort of puff up and say, "Oh, isn't this good? We really have this presence here." I think to myself, I'm not sure you're quite the right person to be talking to these people, because you're missing the point if you get carried away with all that. I think it's understanding the people you're talking with, doing the research, spending time with them, learning about their families, all that stuff is what counts. Generally speaking, we're pretty good at it.
Thanks, and thanks, Peter, for the question. Any other questions? Would you mind coming up, Jeff? Sorry, I know you've got a big voice, but... Thanks, mate. You have to bend down a bit on it, mate.
Yeah, big voice for a big man.
Thanks, Andy, for a fascinating talk. You mentioned that Australia's strategic position in the region is probably one of the more difficult times we've had. I was just wondering whether you might be able to comment on the extent to which AUKUS, which you've already mentioned, but also the Quad, have perhaps redressed some of these concerns.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mentioned AUKUS to make a point earlier on, but it's good to go back to it. In the end, the principle of working with others and working with like-mindeds in the region, in my view, is a really good principle. That fictitious official I was almost describing a moment ago, who's a bit caught up with Australia's strength and projection in the region, might also not be prepared to share responsibility much with our partners. I've seen that in some former colleagues. And I think it's very short-sighted. It's not the right way to go. We actually need to work with others, and we should welcome the involvement of like-minded democracies who stand for similar values to ourselves. In the end, my own concern about Chinese, let's name it, influence in the region is less about naval bases and military projection, and it's more about a competition for values. It's more about influence on systems of governance, respect for the media, principles around corruption. Those are the things that I am more concerned about, and I think it's useful for other countries that stand for similar values to ourselves to be alongside us in the region. So, a more substantial alliance with the United States and the United Kingdom in the region is important. The Quad, in my own view, is even more important because there you're collaborating with, the two major democracies of the region. I know I left Indonesia out, but in terms of ability to project, certainly Japan and India are very significant allies, and we should be more used to working with them. If the world is, as it seems to be, going to fragment a bit over time, then we do have to work in these coalitions with people who believe in the same things that we do. So I think it's terribly important. I think it's a shame that we abandoned the Quad for a period there, the Quadrilateral Alliance, but we're back, and I think it's important to think about the Quad not only as a military alliance. You can do all sorts of things under that rubric, including in the development space. So, really useful. Gee, people are willing to come and stand up, aren't they? Must
Thanks.
be fear of you.
No, it's really helpful for James, and I don't have to repeat the question then.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for the talk. One question I have, which is repeating a comment that was made by the former Singapore Foreign Minister George Yeo. He saw one of the biggest risks was the instability in the US. And if you take the assumption that it was the US that sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline, do you think that makes them an unreliable partner?
Great question.
Well, I'm not so sure about the pipeline, but I'll respond squarely to the fundamental intent behind the question. I think you remind us that the whole idea of working with countries that have similar values is based on them actually having similar values. And there were times when Donald Trump was President of the United States where people did start to ask themselves whether the United States would remain the natural ally, fundamental ally of this country forevermore. Were he to return, were he President of the United States right now, at this very difficult moment, Lord knows where we'd be. And I for one believe that the US is restoring itself and working its way back to where it should be, and actually playing quite a positive role in the region. I don't believe that it was responsible for the sabotage in the Baltic, but nor am I an expert in that sense, so I won't get into an argument about it. But I do think that we need to test the temperature of these relationships from time to time. It's been really interesting to watch the trajectory of the Lowy surveys that are conducted across the Australian public about how we Australians feel about different countries. Trust in China has deteriorated dramatically in the course of the last 10 years. Trust in the United States has also wavered. And, if the US was to become a very different country, then maybe our alliance with the US would come into question. But I'm more optimistic about the US than that.
Can I just ask,
I'll repeat the question back.
Yep.
Yeah.
when you say it's important about values, I mean, we interact daily with people who have different values all the time. So if it doesn't matter individually or personally, why does it matter between countries? I do not understand the values argument.
The values argument as it plays out in fragile economies and countries of the Pacific, I think, is important. This is not about benign differences in values. I have seen the impact of a different set of values in places like Papua New Guinea and smaller countries of the Pacific in terms of how money can buy change of policy at the local level, which results in the death of women and children through malnutrition, simply because corners are cut, contracts are bought, real drugs are replaced with fake drugs, I've seen situations where the media is intimidated and bullied in the Pacific under the influence of our strategic competitor. That's where I think values matter. I do think there is a competition of values. Can we reach across that value divide and engage with China? Of course we can. It's in our interests too. But there is a competition of values in a vulnerable space. Might sound patronising, but I'm drawing on decades of engagement in this part of the world and saying it. I think it's a danger.
This is a direct flow on from that. I talked earlier about relationships. To what extent is that, call it a strategy, but that sounds rather cold-hearted. To what extent is that interfered with by the problem that a lot of the agents that one is interacting with are corrupt scoundrels?
So shall I repeat the question? The question I think was, how focus on relationship can be complicated, not your words, but can be complicated by the fact that sometimes you're dealing with corruption, you're dealing with corrupt individuals. You're not always dealing with corruption. I mean, I think about Papua New Guinea, which is, people say a lot of stuff about corruption in Papua New Guinea, and I've seen it. I've seen what a lack of transparency can bring. It's not quite what you think it is, but I can talk later about what corruption in Papua New Guinea really looks like. Actually, most politicians and officials in PNG, to take that example, wake up in the morning and want to do the right thing and want to make improvements for their communities. They're pushed and pulled in all sorts of different ways. And to the extent that corruption plays out, it's essentially people under pressure from family and community groups to deliver for their own kind. People struggle with this. The people who are out there just wanting to line their own pockets are few and far between, actually. You get to work out who's who, and you get to adjust your approach accordingly. If you're only going to deal with people you regard as clean, then you may as well not be representing Australia and Papua New Guinea, because you have to be a realist about the context in which you operate. You always have to be alive to what you're working with.
Does that mean that Australian agents in this interaction might be well advised to bribe on occasion?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It certainly doesn't mean that. Both Australian business and Australian government officials know that their careers and their lives would be over if they were to engage in this way. You find your way around. You find your way around. It's not quite as hard as people think.
Sorry. I think we've got time for one more question. So Stephen.
I'll just shout from here.
Okay, shout.
So thanks for the talk. You mentioned climate change a couple of times. I was curious to hear your thoughts about how climate change might influence the nature of our relationship with the region during the decades ahead.
Yeah, thanks. It's fundamental. Frank Bainimarama, the Prime Minister of Fiji, said it very clearly after the AUKUS announcement. He said, if the West can afford to spend all this money on defence capital, you'd think they'd be able to do something about climate change. It really matters. The Pacific Islands nations are conscious of their own very serious challenges, which will require relocation of populations and some of the smaller atoll countries in our lifetime. But they're also conscious that the Pacific is a bit of a laboratory, if you like, for the rest of the world, because what happens there tells us what's going to happen globally. They have a message to give the world, and we need to listen to it. And I believe we need to respond. As I said before, I think we're getting better at that. And I think that try and take the politics out of it if you can, just as talk about these issues more successfully than the previous government, simply as a reflection of its own domestic policy. It's got something fresh to say, and that will tide us over a bit. But you know, I think we all know we need to step up further over time. It's fundamental.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks everyone. I think we should close now. In closing, I want to thank Ian especially, Lisa, thank you, everyone for being here, Fuller's and Maddie from Fuller's for bringing the book. And so if we close now, it gives us 5 minutes for people to buy books, get Ian to sign the books and have a chat with him over the table.
Yeah.
And also grab another drink if they need one. Thank you very much. Just a reminder from our next event is on the 19th of October. It will be
Nicholas Koppel.
What?
Nicholas Koppel.
Oh, Nicholas, I remembered his name. Nick Koppel from Myanmar, talking with Nicholas Farrelly from here, both of them experts on Myanmar. But it will be, what's the name of the building again, James? Sorry.
Harvard Room.
The Harvard Room, over in the Centenary Building. So, welcome to all of you there. The catering won't be quite as posh as tonight, but thanks to the team at the club for looking after us. Thank you.
Thank you.